My name is Paige Howard, and the night everything broke started with a single sentence. You embarrass this family every time you open your mouth. Paige! He said it in front of everyone, his father's partners, the servers frozen mid-step, even the photographers pretending not to look. And my fiancé just stood there, smiling like I deserved it. In that moment, something inside me shattered, not because of what he said, but because he didn't stop it. That kind of silence wounds deeper than any insult. So I left the table, heels clicking against marble, heart pounding through shame and fury. I didn't know that stepping outside that night, into the snow, into the dark, would lead me to a stranger on the roadside, and to the moment my whole life would turn upside down. The road to Denver shimmered under a curtain of snow, the kind that made the world too quiet. My wipers moved in slow rhythm, clearing just enough to see the white haze ahead. The car smelled faintly of coffee and cold air. My palms tight around the steering wheel as I rehearsed polite smiles I didn't mean. I was on my way to the Kingsleys' estate, the kind of house that could look down on a city and forget it existed. Ethan had called twice already, reminding me not to be late. He didn't need to say it again. The dashboard clock glowed 6:12. My stomach tightened. The dinner was at 6 sharp. The word sharp hung in my head like a blade. I pressed harder on the gas, watching the snow swirl like ash across the headlights. Then, at the edge of the gas station parking lot, I saw him. A man sat on the curb, wrapped in a shredded army jacket, head bowed under a cap stiff with frost. His sign was nothing more than cardboard. The words scrawled in shaky marker, Army vet, hungry. I slowed before I could think, pulled to the side, and rolled down the window. The cold rushed in like a reprimand. He looked up, startled, blue eyes raw from windburn. I handed him the hot coffee from the cup holder and the spare blanket I kept for long drives. For a second, he didn't take them. Then his fingers closed around the cup. Trembling. Steam rose between us. Most people only stop when there's a camera, he said. Voice gravelly but calm. The sentence landed somewhere deep, where logic and pity stopped arguing. I wanted to say something back, something about not needing a reason, but the words tangled and died in my throat. I only managed a small nod before pulling the car door shut, back on the road. My pulse raced faster than the engine. 6:18. I pressed the accelerator, heart hammering at the thought of being late to a man who measured respect by minutes. Snow kept falling, covering the tracks behind me as if nothing had happened, but something had. A stranger's voice, a paper sign, a stoplight, and a choice that lasted less than a minute. And somewhere, buried under the sound of the storm, I had the uneasy feeling that what I'd just done, what felt so small, had already begun to change everything. I arrived at the Kingsleys' estate with snow still clinging to my coat and dread heavy in my stomach. The drive had taken longer than I expected, and the guard at the gate checked my name twice before letting me through. Inside, the air smelled of polish and money, too clean, too controlled. Ethan was waiting near the staircase, his face pale with the kind of fear that has nothing to do with love. He leaned close, his voice barely a whisper. You're late. He won't forgive this. I followed him into the dining hall. The room was vast and silent, the table stretching like a runway of glass and silver. At the far end sat a man I recognized instantly. The air left my lungs. The worn army jacket was gone, replaced by an immaculate suit. But the eyes, the same piercing blue, steady and assessing, met mine with calm recognition. Warren Kingsley looked at me for a long moment before speaking, his tone smooth and even. Miss Howard. We meet again. My heart stuttered. Ethan glanced between us, confused, while I fought to keep my face still. Warren gestured to the chair across from him. I sat, my pulse roaring in my ears. Conversation flowed around the table, meaningless words about politics and markets. I could feel Warren's gaze resting on me like a quiet weight. When the others paused to sip their wine, he spoke again, so softly only I could hear. Why did you stop? I hesitated, the truth slipping out before I could shape it, because I know how it feels to be left behind. Something flickered in his expression, a small, unexpected warmth, gone almost as soon as it appeared. He gave a faint smile, not of amusement, but of acknowledgement, and returned to cutting his steak as though nothing had been said. When dinner ended, I rose to leave, my hands cold despite the heat of the room. Warren stood, adjusting his cufflinks, and said in that calm, precise voice, "You didn't stop for a test, but you passed one." The words followed me down the corridor, threading through the sound of my heels on marble. I had come here desperate to make a good impression. Instead, I walked out shaken, wondering what kind of man tested kindness, and why I suddenly felt like I'd been chosen for something I didn't understand. Morning light spilled through the blinds, too bright for the headache pressing behind my eyes. The phone buzzed on the nightstand. Ethan's name flashed first, then another call immediately after, from an unknown number. I answered without thinking. "Miss Howard, this is Warren Kingsley." His voice was measured, almost kind. "I have a proposition." He explained that he'd watched a short documentary I'd made years ago, one about forgotten veterans rebuilding homes in Montana. He wanted to finance my next project, a full-length film about American soldiers who'd fallen through the cracks. The offer was absurdly generous. Ethan walked in halfway through the call. When I hung up, his expression hardened. "He's manipulating you," he said, "buying you with conscience." I tried to smile, but the unease settled in my chest. Later that afternoon, I met Warren at his downtown office. The building was all glass and steel, reflecting the sky like a mirror too clean to touch. He greeted me with that same composed half-smile and said simply, "I don't invest in people. I invest in conscience." I wanted to believe him. I needed to. For once, it felt like someone with real power cared about the stories I'd been trying to tell. I signed the paperwork that evening, convincing myself this was purpose, not pity. But as I researched, the optimism began to splinter. Old military contracts surfaced under the Kingsley name. Buried among them was a report. An explosion in Mosul. Faulty equipment. 14 dead. The company listed as supplier. Kingsley Defense Systems. The words blurred. I remembered the heat, the dust, the scream of the dying soldier I'd held as I filmed, his voice breaking with blood. Tell them it was the contract, not the war. My hand shook. The file slipped to the floor. The room spun with the sound of my heartbeat. The man who had offered me redemption had once manufactured the reason I could never sleep through the night. I sat there in silence, the edges of the truth cutting through every shred of gratitude I had left. What do you do when the person who saves your work turns out to be the ghost behind your worst memory? I didn't have an answer, only the cold certainty that this story, whatever it was becoming, had just turned on me. Not every ghost comes from war. Some live quietly inside us, waiting for the right silence to speak. The project started with good intentions. The Forgotten Soldiers was supposed to give faces to the stories America had stopped caring about, men and women who came home with no one waiting. I filmed in shelters that smelled of rain and cheap soup, in motels filled with smoke and broken televisions. Most of them had the same stare, distant, polite, unfinished. One afternoon, at a veterans center in Pueblo, an old Marine looked straight into my camera and said, "We fought for contracts, not for country." The words sliced through the air. I froze behind the lens, my skin prickling. I had heard that line before, 7 years ago, in Mosul, from a soldier bleeding out in the dirt. That night, I dug out my old hard drive. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. The explosion, the dust, the dying man clutching my hand. Behind him, the camera caught a jagged scrap of metal, stamped with a name I couldn't forget once I saw it. Kingsley Defense Systems. My heart stopped. The same company that now paid for my film had built the weapon that tore his body apart. I drove to Ethan's condo without thinking. When I told him what I'd found, his face drained of color. "Don't start this again." "Paige, Nobody wants to hear about the past. I asked him once, "Did you know?" And his silence was the answer. He looked away, jaw tight, and I realized I'd never been part of his world. I was just the reminder of everything he wished his family could bury. The ghosts I'd been chasing weren't strangers anymore. They lived in my house, wore his last name, and signed his father's checks. When I walked into Kingsley Tower, the receptionist went still, as if she could sense I wasn't there for business. Warren's office was a cathedral of glass and quiet. He stood near the window, snow falling behind him, his reflection pale against the skyline. "You think I don't carry ghosts too?" he said, still looking out at the city. He told me about his wife, a combat nurse who spent years patching up soldiers burned by the weapons his factories made. She came home one night and never came back. Since then, he said, he'd stopped believing in goodness. His experiments, the disguises, the tests, were his way of searching for proof that decency still existed. My throat tightened. "You weren't testing them," I said. "You were begging to believe again." He turned, the faintest trace of a smile on his face. Maybe. And maybe I found someone who made me believe again. The air between us felt heavy, a fragile understanding too sad to name. Outside, Ethan was waiting in his car, eyes red, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. When I opened the door, he exploded. "What are you trying to prove? That my father's a monster and you're a saint?" I didn't raise my voice. "I just want you to look at the truth." He slammed his hand on the dashboard. "The truth will kill him." "No, Ethan," I said softly. "The truth is the only thing that might save him." He looked away, shoulders shaking, and I knew I'd lost him. The snow kept falling, muffling everything, even the sound of our love breaking apart. When I drove home, Denver's lights shimmered through the frost, sharp and distant. Behind me, the tower glowed like a lantern built from gilt and glass. I understood then that telling the truth would cost me everything, but silence had already taken more than I could bear. People wear masks to look strong. That night, I had to take mine off. The Kingsley Gala gleamed like a crown, chandeliers blazing above a sea of uniforms and champagne smiles. Senators, generals, investors, all of them owed something to Warren Kingsley. I sat beside him, pretending to breathe normally. Ethan leaned close, voice trembling, begging me not to ruin the night. "He sees you as family," he whispered. The ballroom felt staged, too perfect, too polished. Every compliment was a performance, every laugh rehearsed. Then I saw a name printed on the guest list lying on my plate. Margaret Hollins. When she approached, I recognized her instantly, the mother of the soldier who had died in my arms years ago. Her voice shook as she stared at me. "You were there. You saw them die, and you said nothing." The words hit harder than any accusation. Ethan pulled me aside, pleading. "If this comes out, it'll destroy him," I whispered back. "Some things need to fall before we can stand." A quiet voice came from behind us. Warren stood by the door, steady and unflinching. "If you want to test me, Miss Howard, do it in front of everyone." And in that moment, the celebration turned into Judgment Day. I once thought truth only needed to be said. That night, it had to be seen. When Warren took the stage, his words echoed through the glittering hall. "Tonight we honor not the steel we built, but the hands that held it." Then he turned to me. "Miss Howard, the floor is yours." Applause filled the air as I walked up, my speech burning unread in my pocket. I opened my laptop instead. One touch, and the lights dimmed. The screen behind me came alive. Images of soldiers, smoke, and a dying voice gasping, "Tell them it was the contract, not the war." The logo, Kingsley Defense, glared under the spotlight. Gasps. Silence. Margaret wept. Ethan shouted, "You've killed him!" But Warren stood, calm as ever. "No, son," he said softly. "She just brought me back to life." He raised his glass, wine glowing crimson under the lights. "To truth, the only weapon that never kills. And then he walked away through the stunned crowd, leaving me beneath the glow of the screen, unsure if I had saved a man or burned an empire to ash. Truth had saved one soul, but it took everything else from me. The morning after the gala, the world erupted. Headlines flashed across every screen. Billionaire Warren Kingsley exposed by his future daughter-in-law. News anchors dissected every second of the video, turning my act into spectacle. Stocks plunged. Investors fled. The government opened an inquiry. Ethan vanished. He stopped answering calls, messages, even the friends we once shared. My inbox filled with threats, some from strangers, others from colleagues who suddenly remembered my flaws. In every reflection, I saw the woman they'd painted me to be. Reckless, cruel, naive. Then, late one afternoon, a courier arrived with a thick envelope sealed in red wax, stamped with the Kingsley crest. Inside lay a handwritten letter. Truth costs fortune, but buys peace. You gave me something money could never buy. A clean conscience. Keep filming. Keep stopping. Beneath it was a legal document transferring his personal assets to a new foundation, the Veterans Truth Initiative. My hands shook as I read it. The words felt final, like a farewell disguised as grace. The next morning, the news confirmed it. Warren Kingsley had resigned, retreating from every public board and camera. His final image played across my TV, standing straight, calm, free. That night, snow blanketed the street outside my window, soft and endless. I stepped onto the porch, watching the world fall silent under white. I had lost my reputation, my safety, my love. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the truth. It had already burned everything false away. He left the world the same way he entered my life, quietly, but leaving light behind. 6 months had passed since the gala. I was living in Colorado Springs, teaching a small group of veterans how to tell their own stories through film. The days were slower there, the air filled with pine and wind, the kind of silence that let wounds breathe. One afternoon, a knock broke the stillness. When I opened the door, Ethan stood there, thinner, older somehow, holding a worn army jacket in his hands. His voice trembled as he spoke. My father died last week. He kept this, the one he wore at the gas station. In the pocket, there was your name. My throat closed. Ethan's eyes watered as he added, he said you reminded him that compassion still exists. Neither of us said much after that. The distance between us was filled with something softer than forgiveness, something closer to peace. The funeral was small, held at the National Cemetery under a wide Colorado sky. Rows of veterans stood at attention as the flag draped over Warren's coffin rippled in the wind. When they asked me to speak, I said only, he built weapons, but died building peace. A hush fell over the crowd. The scent of melting snow drifted through the pines. I knew then he'd been forgiven, not by the world, but by his own conscience. After the service, Ethan handed me a camera wrapped in cloth. Inside was a small metal plate engraved with the words, "For the stories that were never told." I smiled through tears. That was his final message. Keep filming, keep stopping, keep believing that truth and kindness still matter. A year ago, I stopped out of instinct. Today, I stop out of faith. The sun was sinking low as I drove home from class. The Colorado sky painted in gold and fading blue. Traffic slowed near a familiar intersection, the same one I passed every evening. At the corner stood a man with a gray beard, his coat too thin for the coming cold. He held a cardboard sign, its words simple and aching, "Veteran, need work," for a moment. I only watched him through the glass. The light of dusk touched his hair, and just for a second, I saw Warren standing there, calm, patient, waiting to be seen. I reached into my bag, pulled out a sandwich and one of the small cards for the Veterans Truth Initiative. When I handed them through the open window, the man looked startled, then smiled. "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly, his voice carrying something familiar. Humility, dignity, survival. The light turned green. I nodded, easing the car forward. On the radio, a voice recording played from an old interview. Warren's voice, steady as ever. Wealth builds walls. Truth breaks them, I whispered back. Some walls deserve to fall. Snow began to drift from the orange sky. Thin and quiet, the road stretched ahead, glowing under the last light of autumn. As I drove on, I realized I'd just relived the beginning. Only this time, there was no fear, no hesitation. Kindness no longer felt like a reaction. It had become a rhythm, steady, quiet, and unbreakable. A habit of the soul that would keep moving long after me.